Welcome to Through a Glass Darkly Radio on United Public Radio. Welcome back, everyone. I just want to say that the intro music was Mark of the Doomslayer by Carl Casey at Whitebat Audio. Today we have another fantastic guest, Dr. Paul Thigpen. Dr. Paul Thigpen is the editor of Tan Books and was appointed as a lay representative on the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops National Advisory Council, speaking frequently at conferences and scholarly gatherings in the U.S. and abroad. He earned a BA in Religious Studies from Yale University and an MA and PhD in Historical Theology from Emory University. A best-selling author, Dr. Thigpen has published 42 books, including Manual for Spiritual Warfare and Saints Who Battled Satan, 17 Holy Warriors Who Can Teach You How to Fight the Good Fight and Vanquish Your Ancient Enemy, and more than 500 articles for both scholarly and popular audiences. His work has been translated into 12 languages. Paul, welcome back,
Sean,
my friend.
great to be here, brother. Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, so a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about, we talked about on my channel, YouTube channel. So some of it we're going to cover. Some of it will be new as well. So I think one place to start is kind of with some of the current things that have come out about disclosure, kind of where you think we are in that process. Just as a reminder, we had the kind of the Arrow report, which, in summation was kind of, there's nothing to see here. These aren't the droids you're looking for, this sort of information. And then there's some whistleblowers that I think continue to come out. And then I think you mentioned before the call that you were continuing to do some work with Soul. So really quick, where do we stand, do you think, on disclosure? And then if you could talk a little bit briefly about what you're doing with the Soul Foundation right now.
Okay. Well, gosh, it's hard to sum up what's going on in the UAP conversation, as I like to call it
Yeah,
right
you
now.
can take as much time as you need. I think it'll be interesting to hear your perspective.
Well, just I am convinced that things are going on behind the scenes. A lot of folks have gotten frustrated, thrown their hands up, and said, "You've only been teasing us all this time, and there's never any proof." But I know personally, some of the folks that have said that and are in a position to know what's going on behind, and I take them at their word. They're honest people, and so I do think things are going on. I think the big question is we can't totally predict what Congress is going to do, and if Congress doesn't do what I think it should do, that it should reassert its or assert its proper supervision of certain programs and attempt to be transparent at least certain ways. Doesn't have to reveal national secrets, but if Congress doesn't do that, then I think eventually somebody from another direction is going to start to reveal things. It could be things coming in from the scientific community. It could be whistleblowers. It could be either from intelligence community, Department of Defense, or even from the aerospace industry. But sooner or later, there's just so much being seen and experienced. I can't imagine that they're going to be able to put it all back in the toothpaste tube again. How much will happen this year? I don't know. I'm eager to see Lou Elizondo's book. I'm eager to read the op-ed that'll be coming out, I hope soon, from Dave Grush. Talked with him the other day, and I think it's coming soon. And I have to keep just saying that the folks be patient and wait. I know we're all tired of waiting. I've been waiting my lifetime to finally get to some disclosure about these things since I was a kid. And I don't know how much longer I have, so I'd really like to see it come out. But anyway, I'm hopeful, but I don't know that it would be the Department of Defense or the intelligence community that makes some kind, or even the executive department that makes kind of disclosure. I expect it probably to come from other directions.
Yeah, I think that's the way it's going to. But it's almost, even if the DoD or the executive, I mean, like let's look at it from Biden's perspective, right? He's got a tight election ahead of him, and the last thing he needs is this issue to kind of weigh him down from from the perspective of people who aren't as involved in this issue or believe it actually, which is unfortunately, as much as we'd not like to admit, is probably the vast majority of Americans. I mean, even Grush's hearing, you talked to, I mean, he admitted this stuff in front of a session of Congress, and you ask the average American, and they're like, "Who? What? Like vehicles? Like non-human vehicles from?" And they look at you like you're crazy. That's not. What are you talking about? And it's like, no, that was under oath. Under oath, he made those statements. How is he doing? To the extent that you could talk about it, when you like, how are his spirits and things like that?
Oh, really, really good. Yeah, I could say that he's very, very positive, very courageous man, very clear thinking. Has a persevering spirit, you might say, about all this. It's important to him. He knows it's important to everyone else, in the sense of whether they realize it or not. It's important to the human race, and so I'm convinced he will not give up what he's doing. He won't give up, even if he gets all kinds of opposition. He's a good man.
Now, if Arrow released its initial report, it also released this document, I think last week or the week before, about Kona Blue. Are you familiar with this document and what it entails?
I haven't. I've actually been on the road speaking for the last couple of weeks, off and on.
No worries.
I've seen headlines, but I haven't been able to look at that. I'd heard of it before, but I understand that something came out. So
yeah, there's no test on this. I was just that was just curiosity on my part. But the weird thing about that is it's like the complete opposite of the other report. Like, it reveals a lot of interesting tidbits. There's a lot of it refers or seems to allude to the NIDS program with Bigelow. It doesn't, it's, one can argue that it's a slam dunk, but it's pretty obvious. It's like the same square footage of Skinwalker Ranch, 480 acres, just like little details like that point to it. But you can't say with 99. You could probably say with 90%, 99% certainty, but you can't say with 100% certainty. However, there were, projects looking at temporal translation. To me, that means time travel. Mm-hmm. They were looking at materialization, dematerialization of objects, which I think you can probably refer to as apports, and all sorts of this strange phenomenon. And it was released by Arrow. Now, I don't know what the purpose of it was. And I think it was released by the Department of Homeland Security, which is also kind of interesting how they stovepipe that, right? Because the military can't legally operate within the United States because of the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, right? But unless there's a national emergency. But I don't know if that applies by its very definition. I don't think that applies to the Department of Homeland Security. So that was kind of interesting.
So much going on. Yeah, it's hard to keep up with it all, but
now, with the Vatican, do you think there's any chance that they take more of a active approach, or do you think they kind of might just be more conservative, traditionally conservative, and kind of just sit back and kind of adapt to what's happening?
Hard to say. When you say the Vatican, you're talking about thousands of people. It's a sovereign nation, small, but so you can say what would the Pope say, or you can say what might one of the dicasteries, they call it, or other departments might say, and often just someone in the Vatican will make a statement, and then people will say the Vatican says. But that's kind of like having a congressman say something and say Congress says. It's a big thing. You had asked before, and I didn't answer. What I'm doing with Saul now is writing a white paper, and I'm hoping that this paper and other efforts will begin to get Catholic leadership, both in the church itself and in the Catholic academic world, to begin, first of all, understanding more about what really is going on, has gone on, because it's been dismissed, in the media for so long. There is all kinds of extensive evidence and eyewitness testimony. And second, to help them to realize that, as my book shows, the one I wrote on this topic, that there's plenty of room in the Catholic tradition and the broader Christian tradition to to accommodate this, to make a place for this. It's been in the conversation since before the time of the birth of the Christian faith, the lifetime of Jesus, and from early centuries has been discussed, and people didn't see it as a tinfoil hat thing at all. All through Western civilization, some of the greatest minds and hearts of Western civilization, starting with the ancient Greeks, but up through church history, took it very seriously and talked about it and speculated all kinds of things. And some of them were, central Christian figures who would be hard to claim or didn't know the faith or somehow were contradicting the faith by what they were saying. So I'd like to encourage Catholics to, my book would be a place to start, but to begin to see this conversation has been going on for a long time. There's been a lot of room. There are a lot of possibilities. And if there is other non-human intelligence besides angels, then it would open up all kinds of questions for us, but nothing to be panicking about. So I hope that ultimately the Vatican, in a very official way, would begin to take that way. Already, people like Ross Coulthart and others have said that they think the Vatican has been much more open than many of the other groups that they've seen. And you have things like, quote in my book, how Saint John Paul II, the Pope, was once asked by a little girl in a public audience, what about aliens? And his answer was not, oh, that's contrary to faith, or we don't know, or science has to tell us. It's a very affirmative statement. And he said, always remember they're God's children too. And I think that kind of characterizes the traditional Catholic view anyway, that this openness to that. So again, my hope is that at some point, perhaps the Vatican could take leadership on that, because it's an international community. There wouldn't be as much politics, I would think, involved as would be if China were announcing or the U.S. were announcing or Russia, and then having some kind of Cold War over the information. It's not as if the Vatican's going to be trying to weaponize crash retrieval like some of the governments probably are, other governments. So yeah, I'm hopeful.
Even corporations, right? I mean, for all we know,
yeah,
they may be retrieving these things
on their
own. Yeah. I mean, I think it's unlikely. I think they would play within the rules, but you never know, right?
Where there's a lot of money to be made, people can be tempted to do all kinds of things. Yeah.
So, in terms of the knowledge that the Vatican has, and by the way, I agree with you on your characterization of the Vatican, only I'm going to be a little bit more aggressive about it. I think they're the only organization that, to my knowledge, hasn't explicitly lied about the phenomena, right? They're not screaming from the mountaintops, but I don't think I've ever seen something where they have categorically denied that this phenomena exists. And I think that puts them in a pretty good position. That said, I think they have given, I think it's 53 miles beneath the Vatican. There's like a maze of libraries with a ton of different information. So if somebody was a repository or a central repository, if that's even such a thing, because I don't even think that's such a thing in U.S. special access programs, if there is a central repository for knowledge in the Vatican, on this particular topic, where or who do you think that would be?
Well, the Vatican Archives, sometimes it's called the Secret Archives, but there's historical reasons why it's called that. It basically just means that it's not accessible to just anybody who wants to walk in. Right. You can have folks who get clearance for different reasons to do research. I don't. Perhaps there could be a section of it that's devoted to the topic. It could very well, if they've had documentation of different kinds, that it's scattered throughout. Excuse me, because it would fit into different places historically or according to country or something else. I don't know how they organize it. And the truth is, it's such an old and big collection. I can imagine that it's not totally tidy in the way it's organized. It just couldn't be, because it's grown so big for so many years. But I think it would be in that. There might be certain sections that are totally closed. I just don't have the Vatican connections to say.
Do you have a sense for kind of how old some of those documents might be? Like how many thousands of years old Stretching how far back?
Oh, I don't. My guess is they probably have some documents from, say, Mesopotamia, that kind of thing that would go
Wow.
back to BC days. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, a lot of museums in the world have that kind of thing, and they've been collecting for a long time. And sometimes when people found things like that, that's where they wanted it to go, was to the church for keeping. Certainly, documents going back centuries in the history of the church and going back to classical times, documents from the Romans and the Greeks. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if they have documents in Hebrew, Aramaic, and cuneiform. Maybe photographs maybe of it, but they even have some clay tablets and that kind of thing. They also have a museum. So yeah, I mean, think about it. It's been around for 2,000 years. It's a worldwide organization. It has always valued knowledge, and so it just wouldn't surprise me at all that they're collecting all kinds of things.
All right, I have a user question that I'll try to frame this in a different way, but in terms of actually, I was going to ask something not exactly the same as that, but similar. As kind of you look at this topic and the church, and again, I want to be clear: you're not an official, you're not speaking on behalf of the Catholic Church. You're speaking on behalf as a private citizen, etc. How would you, or how might they, or you construct kind of a hierarchy of intelligences? In other words, given the Catholic Church and you, believe, and I think there are non-human intelligences that we would refer to as angels, uh, demons, devils, whatever you want to call them, as well as NHIs that are not that. So I think in a previous podcast interview we talked about Father Sinistrari, and there was an entity that he encountered that was more of a, he tried kind of traditional exorcisms and it didn't work, but it wasn't, it was more kind of a trickster type entity. So stepping all the way back, I'm kind of throwing a lot at you. Is there some sort of hierarchy of being that would be applied to this situation, or is that something as yet to be debated and defined?
Yeah, good question. Obviously, at the very top and in a category all by himself is God. So he's not just a being among beings or the greatest among beings. He is the ground of being. He's the one from whom all creatures that he's made receive their being in the beginning when they're made and to stay in existence. But descending from there, the church has traditionally taught that angels and demons are angels, but they're fallen. They've turned away from God. That they do have powers that are far beyond ours, intelligence and other kinds of things. They're not corporeal. They don't have bodies, so they don't exist within the space-time realm like we do, but they can act
Mm-hmm.
upon it and do things in it. And so you've got them that are in certain ways higher than we are, and yet we've had some special status, and that God Himself has become one of us in order to save us. So depends on how you want to do the hierarchy, whether it's purely about their intelligence and capability, or whether it has to do with other things. Traditionally, so the church hasn't said much about what's beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
It hadn't been revealed to them, but you do have individual Christians. You mentioned Sinistari, but another priest, Herbert Thurston, in the 1900s, and even folks like Saint Augustine and Saint Jerome, two of the greatest minds and scholars of the ancient church in the 4th century, had, because of the evidence presented to them through testimony and that kind of thing, came to the conclusion that there were other non-human intelligences that were being encountered that were not actually demons. They didn't respond to the sacraments and the name of Jesus, the kind of thing that usually makes demons submit. Both Jerome and St. Augustine seem to think that, not to seem to think, I think it was pretty clear that some of the Greek myths probably derived from non-human intelligences that people came wrongly to worship as gods. And again, if someone like Saint Augustine, who's, I think, just about the greatest theologian of ancient times, and then someone like Saint Jerome, who's known as the father of biblical scholarship, they knew their faith as well as anyone. And if both of them said, believe there's room for non-human intelligence besides angels to exist, then I think that makes it pretty clear. It doesn't prove that it is true, but it means that you can believe that without being unfaithful to the tradition. So you have others. Then you mentioned the thing about the trickster. That's a number of exorcists have run into things that, again, they don't act like demons, but they're not human either, and seem to have kind of a prankster attitude. It could be what it's traditionally been referred to as a poltergeist. That just means a noisy ghost. But that kind of, those kind of testimonies have been collected by lots of folks, including Father Thurston, who, and people have, there are other theories about those things, that they might actually be some kind of powers of the human mind, fragments almost of our original ability before the fall, before Adam and Eve turned away, that still show up sometimes, so that it's not actually a separate creature, but it is it's things being done by a particular person in the situation. One reason they think that is that typically in the poltergeist reports, you have a single troubled adolescent who the stuff seems to follow around wherever they go. But you can interpret that a lot of ways. So I'm just saying, other than God himself, of course, humans and angels, the Christian tradition, especially the Catholic tradition, doesn't officially affirm other examples, but it certainly has room for it. It doesn't deny it. There's some who try to claim that the Catechism of the Catholic Church rules it out. But if they read my book, I hope they will. I think you can see that it's, if you look at it and don't read it in a proof texting way, if you look at it in light of other texts in the Catechism, and in light of the text that they're relying on in their footnotes, you see that they're talking about on Earth. They're not talking about extraterrestrial intelligence.
In that book, just for folks to know, is Extraterrestrial Intelligence and the Catholic Faith. But it talks about, it's not just about the Catholic faith, it's also about how some of the other theologians in different faith traditions, as well as scientists and scholars and things like that across the ages of, I think you go talk about Aristotle and, all the way back. So I think it's an excellent work of scholarship that people, I have it right in front of me too, but if I pull it out, I have this big pile of books, they'll all collapse. Okay, I know I'm jumping a lot of different places, and forgive my ignorance on this question, but I've really never asked this to someone who's as steeped in this knowledge base as you are. What happened to the Book of Enoch? And because it's not, it's not in the traditional Bible that we all know. I didn't even think I knew about it until, maybe 5 years ago or something. I had no idea. When did it kind of go away, or was it never even a part? I think it kind of just, at one of the councils, it was kind of pulled out. But when did it go away? Why did it go away? And have you reviewed it, and kind of what's your view of it? That's like a bunch of questions. So
yeah.
It gives you some flexibility to talk about a wide-ranging topics, not necessarily have to answer them.
As far as date of composition, I have to look that up. But it's a book for the Jewish tradition, and largely a very speculative commentary to the point of mythology, I would say, kind of a mythology. Not that that's a bad word, but on certain passages like the 6th chapter of Genesis. And so it definitely was never part of the actual canon of Jewish scripture. And it was more like a much later commentary. A lot of people read it. A lot of people thought it useful and, referred to it. In the New Testament and in the Christian church, it was never part of the canon. It's not like the church took it out. It was not part of the Jewish canon. It was not part of their canon. You did have early Christians who read it and liked it a lot. But I think, the folks who finally made the decisions about what books would be included in scripture did not include it. Again, it wasn't there, and then they took it out. It's just there are a lot of books out there that they said this is, either, in this case, probably would have said this is all kind of, how do I put it? It's speculation, but not just speculation. Pretty extensive speculation to the point that a whole mythology's been woven here. So you do have today a lot of people looking at that, and it talks about all kinds of other creatures, the Watchers, the Nephilim, coming from Genesis 6 and other things, giants and interbreeding and all of that, um, coming from the Book of Enoch. But you have one New Testament place that seems to allude to it, without actually quoting. But even if it did allude to it, it wouldn't mean that it should be part of Scripture. The Book of Acts also alludes to pagan Greek poet and some others. That doesn't mean they thought that was part of Scripture. They're just making a point.
Right.
So I think it's unfortunate that a lot of folks today seem to treat that book as if it were the Word of God, as if it were alongside other Scripture. They have the wrong idea that the Catholic Church came along and took things out. No, books like that were never part of it, even in the Jewish tradition. It's not part of Scripture yet. So I would encourage people. You might want to read it for the fun of it, but it is just a speculation that gets so complex that it. I keep using the word mythology, but it kind of ends up being like a drawn out, elaborate mythology. Can't find much reason why I would think there was anything historical about it.
And when you say the Watchers, what does that is that something that is only in the Book of Enoch, or is that outside of the Book of Enoch?
I'm sure there must be other books that will quote it or have kind of picked up on the idea. I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong because it's not my major field of extra biblical Jewish text of antiquity, but I'm pretty sure that's probably where the idea would find its locus. It's kind of center of gravity, but maybe other folks picked up on it and borrowed it. I'm not sure, but I mean, the main thing is it's never been part of the Scripture of the Jewish people or the Christian people, and it certainly was never taken out. It's if people want to read more about that kind of thing, I'd encourage them to read the Old Testament instead of the Book of Enoch. It's wild and speculative. It might be fun to read. You can make movies out of it and have been, but I don't think it has a lot to really say about UAP and this conversation.
Okay, the other thing, and I'm going to kind of forgive me for going a little bit off track, but I think it's somewhat relevant. Are you familiar with the Chris Bledsoe case?
Just a little, yeah. Not real familiar. I have the book now, his book UFO of God, and I need to read it, but I haven't had time recently.
Okay, a lot of, I think, what he experienced seems to be very similar to what the Catholic Church has defined historically. I'm not saying this is the case in this one, but there are some parallels with Marian apparitions, right? So the lady, if you kind of put as a stand-in for Mary, it kind of has like a Lourdes feel to it, or a I'm trying to Portugal. Why am I not remembering this? Fatima feel to it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, what's your, again, recognizing that you're not super familiar with the case, what's your take on that? Is it something entirely different? Is there a possibility that it's the same phenomena? Is it or is it just there's just not enough information?
Well, I don't have enough information. I could there was a few hours from here, so might be able to visit them sometime, but wouldn't want to make a judgment. Some of the things I've read about the lady, it's for instance, would maybe think it's not Mary, someone else. But but I wouldn't want to say too much about it until I've actually read the book and maybe even at some point had a chance to talk to Mr. Bledsoe himself.
Yeah, and just to be clear, it never identified itself as Mary
sure.
or anything like that. And then, but again, like if you just read the accounts, like the direct accounts, as opposed to kind of the accounts written about the accounts, there seem to be some similarities. Now, Mary wasn't calling herself Hathor, which
Yeah,
that
for
raises all
starters,
kinds
right.
of that kind of raises all sorts of red flags. But
She said, "I am the Immaculate Conception," not Hathor, right?
right.
So that one of the things I think it's such a good question. One of the things we have to keep in mind is that just because things resemble each other doesn't mean they're the same, even when they're anomalous. Um, so you have a saint who uh, spoke of glowing orbs that would talk to her, and she was convinced they were her guardian angel, or perhaps multiple angels. And I take her at her word because of the Catholic tradition and other things about her life and her veracity. Um, but to take that and then say, oh, it's the same thing as the orb in Mosul or something, um, it's just, it's too simplistic to do that, to make these, because they seem to look alike, make them uh, equivalents, or assume that they're equivalents. I think about how it's down the Georgia coast where I'm from. They have something called horseshoe crabs. I don't know if you've ever seen a horseshoe. I don't know if they live in
Oh
the
yeah,
Pacific,
no, they have them
right?
in New Jersey too. When I went to the
Yeah,
beach
up
as
there,
a
right.
kid.
And you
Yeah.
look at them, and boy, they do look like these big ferocious crabs, a little different. And that's why they're called crabs. But guess what? They're not crabs. They're arachnids. They're in the spider family. And I just use that as kind of a humorous example of how things can look a lot alike, but they're very different things.
Well, they don't
So
even look like the crabs. They have like this like big armor
yeah,
thing with like a
yeah.
long yeah, they don't look at all like crabs.
They've got that, I guess, yeah, kind of the pictures like it. But anyway, same thing. I mean, my wife knows all about the plants in this area in Southern Appalachia. And um, what is that? I was thinking one the other day. It was maybe an Advent rose or something it was called, but it's not really a rose. Maybe it was probably a different one, but something that's called the rose. But if you look at it botanically and down the genetic level and stuff, it's not a rose at all. Um, so we just have to be careful not to, especially with historical texts, seeing a similarity and saying they're the same thing. Um, Also, some folks have looked at some of the things in the Vatican archives that have to do with the canonization of saints, the process by which the Catholic Church comes to declare someone a saint.
Mm-hmm.
And by the nature of the case, one of the things that leads the Church to consider someone to be declared a saint is that there may have been miraculous or anomalous phenomena associated with their lives. But there are things that are kind of traditional in things like levitation. They're traditional within Catholic accounts of saints, and lots of them have had that kind of thing or other stuff. So you have to be careful going and looking at those archives and studying phenomena associated with the lives of saints and say, oh, see, it's the same thing as this. Not necessarily at all.
Well, I mean, there's cases of levitation and demonic possession too, right? Like,
yeah. I've
right?
encountered that
So,
before. Yep.
yeah, it doesn't mean it's light and love and it's all, wonderful and beautiful. You have to, I mean, how should someone navigate? And I think we talked at the very beginning of this discussion that we kind of have to, or you're at least implied that we're kind of moving toward disclosure outside of government, and some of that, could involve some risk. And by risk, what I'm talking about is there seems to be a non-physical aspect of this phenomena, and if you're engaging something like that, there's a risk that how do you know it's a benign NHI or a positive NHI, like what you define as an angel, versus a negative entity like a demon. And we can get into this too, because I said we were going to talk about your two books and we haven't even touched them.
Oh, it's
yet.
fine. It's fine. It's all
But I wanted to prepare you, and I'm like coming out from left field. But in your manual for spiritual warfare, for instance, like you've witnessed exorcisms, right? And you've conducted them, I think, when you were a Pentecostal minister.
Yeah, I never conducted them, but I was present. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You're present, right?
Mm-hmm.
How should people kind of navigate that? Like, and I don't mean like actively seeking the occult. What I mean is, strange things start to happen to people. How should they navigate that? How can they determine if it's benign or malevolent? Given this confusing and navigating through a world in which the government has not officially acknowledged any of this stuff.
And yeah, they're not helping it. They've studied it for sure. But, several things I'd say. First is, I think we have to recognize that we're probably not dealing with just one thing out there.
Mm-hmm.
So many of the accounts, they're so different. Some seem to be nuts and bolts things. Others, you said, seem to be, use the word spiritual, but don't seem to, act the same way.
Yeah, non-physical, I think.
Yeah. So the first thing I think we have to understand is that we can't just. Some people are trying to find a unified field theory for UAP, to put it that way. That some theory that will apply to it all and explain it.
Yeah, that's
all.
like trying to find a unified field theory for the animal kingdom, right?
Or animals and plants and viruses and all kinds of things that just don't quite fit with each other. And so I think we have to recognize that's probably not going to happen. There's just different things out there. Second, then, I affirm in my book and otherwise that some of the cases do seem to be demonic. Folks who, my strongest critics say that it's all demonic, and I really don't think we can say that. The evidence we have, that a lot of them don't fit that profile at all. But some of them certainly do. Some of the abduction stories that we get sure seem to parallel some things that would be in the classical tradition of demonic encounters. I think even about one of the people involved in Skinwalker Ranch not long ago in a Merged podcast. Weaponized podcast. Talked about the hitchhiker phenomenon. Maybe some of your listeners know about that folks involved with the ranch, often when they go back home, something seems to follow them. It's often malevolent. It begins to affect their families, even their neighbors.
Yeah, they did an epidemiological study on that. It has an R naught of 3 apparently, which is I think the same as the pandemic thing.
Yeah, right. It's like that. Things like that. I think there probably is some demonic activity at Skinwalker. First of all, Catholic tradition takes curses very seriously, and even if the curses is pronounced in another religious tradition. And part of the Skinwalker's history is one Native American people cursing another in that area. I could see, demonic openings by that. But this particular person who'd been there talking about the hitchhiker effect at one point says that, I hope I'm remembering correctly, but it's as if his body kind of froze, was paralyzed, and then an alien voice spoke through him. If that was the case, that one fits a diabolical profile easily, possession. I'm not saying he's possessed, but even maybe a momentary kind of thing. So things like that, I have no problem saying those could very well be fallen angels that are malevolent. On the other hand, a lot of things don't fit that. One of the things we have to keep in mind too, and I talk about this in the book, is that we're fallen creatures. God made us, and God made us good. We've turned away from him. And so you got good people, and you got bad people, and people all through the spectrum, and even good people not, doing bad things at times. We can imagine other intelligent races being that way. So we could be visited by races that, number one, are essentially good, but they're fallen in certain ways and treat us the way we treat each other. Or you could have a race that's totally fallen, like the demons, and not redeemed or have a possibility of redemption. That would be pretty scary. The Christian writer C.S. Lewis once talked about that. You can imagine that just as the demons are kind of confirmed to the evil, they'll never repent and become good. What if you had an extraterrestrially embodied race? They would be like embodied demons. And imagine meeting up with them. They're malevolent and with no chance of conversion, of repentance, or changing away. So we could meet up with all kinds of things. The one thing we know is that, as a Catholic, I know is that God created them all, created them good. But if they're evil now, they've turned away like we have. And so there are a lot of possibilities for what we could be meeting up with.
Now, in terms of, let's kind of go with fallen angels for right now. If they kind of start to influence someone, what are kind of the manifestations of that? I think you spoke about this before with oppression, infestation, possession, those sorts of things. If you could talk us through some of that.
Sure. Yeah. It's, there's a long tradition in the Catholic Church about this. That's why we still have exorcists. because we find it to be an ongoing reality. That first of all, that these are the creatures created by God, good, but they turned away from Him, became extremely evil, with no chance of turning back to good. Humans have a chance. We could be evil too, but a chance of being redeemed. But they had one chance, and kind of that was it, because it's a long story. But anyway, and so they're one of their desires is they hate God, they hate the good, they want to get back at Him, and the way they do it is by coming after God's children, who we are. We're made in the image of God, and coming after His image. And so that's what we're dealing with. They have powers, many powers beyond our own. They don't have bodies, so that gives them a certain kind of subtlety and agility that we don't have. But some of the indicators, there are different levels of demonic activity. I mean, you can cut up the pie in different ways, you slice the pie in different ways. But traditionally, you'll have Catholics talk about infestation, for instance, which is where demonic power manifests itself in or through or in the vicinity of certain objects or places. So you may have a room or a building that's been infested. I've been present in one of those before, more than one. And you'll have...
Actually, explain... I know you can't name specific places, but paint a picture of what it's like to enter one of those locations, what it feels like, what you see, what you hear. What's that like?
Well, it's different. Some places, and I'm not talking about, I haven't experienced all these different kinds of phenomena, but right. In some places you do actually hear disembodied screams and groans and things like that. Sometimes there's a foul smell, like it's like burning sulfur. It's the traditional thing. Things could levitate, move around. You could have a window break, sound of footsteps, that kind of thing. But in the case, like one case where I was in, it involved where the temperature in the room would drop suddenly 10 or 15 degrees. And then the appliances, not just a room, but a whole apartment, appliances would start going on and off randomly, being turned on and off randomly, not like a power failure, but just this one's off, then that one's off, that one's on. The faucets would start turning with water randomly at different times. And a cold wind blowing through the apartment, even though there's no AC on and the windows are closed. One particular one that I was in, you had the temperature drop, you had the cold wind blowing, and then a bed levitated and began to oscillate back and forth. So those kinds of things are often pretty good indicators something's going on of that sort. So that's one category. There's a couple of others I entered, but it was after the event where everything had just been trashed in the room. And this is a place where a young woman had at night been assaulted with long scratches down her back, that kind of thing. But that gets us into the next thing where you can have then oppression, where the enemy forces, the diabolical forces, are attacking you in certain ways physically, and may also come after finances and relationships and begin inserting themselves into destroying relationships. It can get worse than with oppression, which typically is more in the mind, but a severe kind of torturous thing where terrible thoughts often of suicide. And I understand some of these things, the mental things especially, can be the result of a mental condition. The church has always affirms that. Somebody comes to a Catholic priest and says, I'm possessed by the devil. Then he doesn't just say, okay, let's have an exorcism. There's a whole protocol that you go through where, right, first you've got to go see a doctor, maybe a psychologist, psychiatrist. Let's see if we can rule out everything else. And if so, then there's certain tests they can do, but that the priest can do. But then before they would take them to an exorcist, you go through ruling all that out. So I want to make it clear that just having a bad thought is not necessarily a demonic thing. For a lot of us, the enemy can speak into our minds, and so can put thoughts in there that aren't good thoughts, and doesn't mean we're possessed by any means. It just means it would be as if somebody standing next to us was putting dark thoughts into our mind.
Is that something that both sides do? So angels and demons kind of
Yeah, because
project.
they're not corporeal,
Yeah.
they don't have a body. They can speak directly into our minds. Usually, and that's what gets a little tricky. We human beings, usually when information comes to us from the outside, we know it's coming. An idea is coming from the outside because it comes through our senses. Or we read it, or we hear it, or something like that. But if the creature that's communicating with us, an angel or a fallen angel demon, doesn't have a body that is able to speak directly into our minds, and the tricky part is trying to discern what's our thought and what's the thought from them, or could be a thought from God. But so that, a big part of my book's kind of about that, trying to sort that out. Not to make everybody terrified that demons are after them all the time, but the temptations are the way most of us have. The temptation to do something wrong to get some kind of benefit illicitly. But in the kind of things we're talking about, it's a much more severe kind of terror. Often includes just horrific nightmares going on, and thoughts of just things you wouldn't even want to talk about, or I wouldn't want to talk about here. And then, but a full-fledged possession, it's somewhat rare, probably less rare than it used to be for various reasons. But and that's where the victim has episodes. It doesn't usually is not ongoing, but episodes where the demonic power will take possession of their body and then do things through them. It can speak through them in an alien voice. It may use their vocal cords. It may not. Often will speak in language the person doesn't know, like Aramaic, biblical, Hebrew, Latin. Often, the body can make all kinds of unusual contortions that aren't usually normal or even possible for a human body. It can levitate, superhuman strength. They can take an iron bar with their hands. It's a little old lady. I knew one case like this, and she just took this thing and bent it like that. So those kinds of things, they're indications something else is going on. And then often,
by the way, for folks just joining us, you're listening to Through a Glass Darkly Radio on United Public Radio, and I'm here with Dr. Paul Thigpen. Sorry to interrupt, Paul. I got to get
good.
in
It's good
before the bottom of the hour.
Yeah. So anyway, it's and a lot of folks out there probably say, "Oh, this is all crazy stuff," but it's not.
But you've seen it. You've been. You said you've been in a room where you've witnessed.
And I know exorcists, and the stories they tell me are like hair raising, and there's no reason not to believe it. Occasionally, it'll make its way into the news media. So I had a case back in Indiana several years back, because often the media don't want to touch it, and certainly public health doesn't want to touch it, and even the police department doesn't want to touch it. In this case, it was such a big deal that you got reports at all those levels, where there was an adolescent boy in a family in a home, and the home was infested, and the boy was exhibiting all kinds of things. And in that case, the police were involved, and you had phenomena like the police going back to his car, and this alien voice, not alien as an ETI, but did not belong to anyone that should have been on that radio frequency. Tell him to get out of there and leave, that kind of thing. And then meanwhile, the front driver's seat was going back and forth by itself, and things like that, where the police, felt they had to report it. And then eventually the boy is he's taken to a health facility, and you get testimony later from health staff there who said, yeah, he levitated, he backed up against a wall and crawled up it like backwards like a spider, and then came over the top and levitated. Now, and these were people reporting this who felt like they had to, but they had nothing to gain and everything to lose by a hoax, but making this all up. And they did finally have to call in the local exorcist. But I'm just saying, that's one example. It finally got into the papers. There's probably been some TV things on it up that if folks don't want to believe me, but it's real. It's real, and it has been always. So that's one good thing is that because I have some background in that, then when I look at the UAP phenomena, the UFOs and encounters and stuff, I think I'm in a good position to say, it doesn't all seem to be diabolical like that stuff. Some of it does seem to be, but a lot of it just is either just strange or surprising. It's anomalous. What exactly it is, hard to say. I'm of the impression of one of the things I know about my book is that there are a lot of scientists would say who are open to the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence, but not here. It couldn't come here because you can't go faster than the speed of light, and that's an absolute. They couldn't get here. But as I say in my book,
unless you bend space time.
Well, exactly.
Right?
I mean, Thomas Kuhn's book
right.
about paradigm shifts in science. If you read history, that's one of the things you find is that scientists could be very firmly, everybody almost convinced of something, and then new information comes and they have to change a whole new paradigm. So I can't be close to that. I just can't be close to that. There could be all kinds of things in which space-time itself is folded, or who knows. So yeah, we have to have two things. We have to have humility, in which we say, okay, I don't understand it, and I may never understand it all. But God is God, and if it's there, He's created it, and so I have to leave it in His hands. But I don't know it all, and I can't know it all. And to recognize there's a lot of mystery in the universe, just things that are too big or too complicated for us to understand, and that's part of humility. Just admit that. Have a sense of wonder. That's what I call it. Wonder.
Now, again, we covered this on my podcast, but I think it's worth covering here. What was kind of the inciting incident that got you involved on trying to understand the phenomena? And by phenomena, I mean kind of the non-demonic, non-angelic kind of aspect of it.
Well, I had a couple of experiences as a kid that got me at least thinking about it. Back in the days, I can't pin down the year, for example, exactly, but because it was such a clear thing that happened and happened repeatedly, I can guess the year because I know exactly what bedroom I was in and where my brother was sleeping and at that time. And so it would have been in the early, maybe mid 60s, long before I would have known anything about the Betty and Barney Hill incident or the whole notion of alien abductions. And now I want to say at the beginning, I don't think I was abducted by aliens. But what happened was I began having a recurring dream that is very similar to what we now, call alien abduction experiences, where I'm lying in bed awake, my brother's asleep. There's a big window by our room. All this is true, it's there. And then this kind of bluish green light shines through on me. I feel cold and I'm paralyzed. I can't scream. I can't do anything. My brother's still asleep. I'm trying to get him. And anyway, and then I wake up. So that was the recurring dream. And so I'm not saying by any means that I was abducted. What I am saying is that it was close enough to what was later, in the literature about abduction experiences that got me thinking about that whole thing. And then the other was in my senior year of high school, saw two anomalous, I wouldn't even call them craft. They're in the sky. They, using today's terms, I'd probably say they looked more like plasma. They were round, but it's not like you were seeing metal or flashing lights. Round, glowing, with mostly white, but with red and green inside them. And so those things just got me thinking about it, and I want to check this out.
I actually think in the Soviet, like the not declassified, but the Soviet literature on all the work that they did with these non-human intelligences, I think they mentioned there were kind of two broad categories of types, and one of them was this plasmoid sort of body type, or I'm not using the right language, but and then the other one, I can't remember what the most common, probably more of a nuts and bolts kind of variety. But for all we know, it could be an organism that just lives in our upper atmosphere.
We don't know. So much we don't know. I know. So anyway, but what those two things did, I'm not making any claims to have had alien encounters by any means. But what it did do is it got my attention and got me to thinking. And then when I started checking out the UFO literature, I read about Project Blue Book. I read about Kenneth Arnold, all those things, and just had this intense interest in it. And it's been there all my life. I mean, there's long periods of time where I just had too many other things to think about, and there wasn't much in the news going on. But what did happen then was I was an atheist from the age of 12 to 18. And after that time, then when I would think about this, I would say, okay, how can I reconcile this with my Christian faith? became Catholic some years later, and still had the question. I'd like to explore that sometime. Did some reading of the history of the UAP conversation, which is so important to me, and then I guess it was maybe 10 or 12 years ago. I was working. Well, you mentioned at the beginning, editor at TAN. That's actually, it's kind of an old bio. But I was working some years ago
sorry.
as editor there. That's all right. I'm retired, and I was walking with the publisher, and we're talking, and we're out on the beach. It was an editorial retreat at Myrtle Beach, and looking for the sky. And I think we saw something kind of anomalous, which could have been all kind of shitty star, whatever. And I said, you're gonna think I'm crazy, but someday I'd like to write a book about extraterrestrial intelligence in the Catholic faith. And he said, write it, I'll publish it. And it took me several years before I could get to it, and it took me 2 years to write it. But especially with that last piece in the New York Times in 2019 that was talking about recovered craft studies, I thought, okay, it's time to write about this, because if this thing's turns out to be they turn out to have this kind of evidence for it, there'll be a lot of people, especially a lot of Christians, asking themselves, how do I reconcile this with my faith? And I trust that my book can help them to do that.
What do you make of those claims that we actually have these vehicles, whatever they may be? They're transdimensional, extraterrestrial. What do you make of these claims?
We have so much kind of witness, so many witnesses, so much evidence. I know a lot of it's obviously behind the scenes, but it just seems to me where there's smoke, there's fire, about some of this stuff. When, back in 2019, when they had the piece about the slide, the famous slide, I don't remember what number it was, 19 or something like that. So folks in Congress are getting this briefing about retrieved crash materials. I was like, oh my gosh, they're talking about this in Congress. I'm convinced personally. It could be wrong. I don't think it's psyops, but I do think there's nuts and bolts stuff they've got that they have recovered. That's just what I think. And but I think for good reason. I mean, someone like David Grush, again, I have no reason to doubt what he's saying, or that they could have such a widely orchestrated plot to disinform him in some way. I just don't see it happening. There are too many people in too many places who aren't related at all, who've made the claims, and not just in the United States, around the world. So, I think it's real, and I'm be quite happy to be, for it to be disproven. Though it's kind of thing that'd be hard to disprove. It's easier to prove than disprove, because all you need is one example of it to.
Yeah, it's like trying to disprove the existence of God.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Or prove the existence. I mean, either way, it's still, you just
if you're talking about something that, a whole class of events, and that's why I have to say to people who say it's all demonic too. Okay, you've got this wide, diverse, worldwide, going on for a long time class of events, and sure, you might be able to give good evidence that these particular ones are demonic, but to go from that to say, therefore, they're all demonic, you can't say that about that class of things like that. They're and you can't say it about any other thing about UAP either, that it's all one thing.
Why do you think the government hasn't rolled this out, or why are they hesitating, or why have they been hesitating for at least 80 years? It might even be, you go back to the Cape Girardeau incident, that was 1941, so it's even predates even the Roswell incident. So 80, 90.
The Foo Fighters too, in World War II,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Or even the ghost rockets. I mean, you could go back to 1897 with the airships, right?
Airships, right? Yeah. It's my guess, your guess is as good as mine. We know all the normal kind of, or usual kind of speculations that so maybe the Department of Defense doesn't quite know what it is themselves, and they don't want to admit that, or that they don't want to admit that they're not totally in control of our skies. This whole thing with drones lately kind of shows that anyway, even if it's drones instead of UAP.
Yeah, well, so you're talking about the Langley Air Force Base.
Yeah, that's just one example of
several. So I have
in several places.
I have a friend who is a highish ranking officer in the Air Force, and he basically told me, I can't really say anything about it other than it's jurisdictional. So my interpretation of that is people are just flying, and even in the press articles, they're not listed as UAPs, they're listed as UASs, so unmanned aerial systems. So what my guess is it could be anybody, Chinese, Russians, or whatever, but they're just somebody's using traditional conventional drones. They're flying it over Langley Air Force Base. And when they say jurisdictional, what that means to me is you don't want U.S. military aircraft firing missiles over civilian suburbs, right? Like, particularly Washington, D.C. suburbs. So,
yeah, yeah.
That's
So
my
all I'm
guess on
saying
that.
is that, I mean, it kind of demonstrates that there are certain ways in which we already know we're not completely in control of our skies. The Chinese spy balloon was another example. But this is how much more so if these things are real and they can't really explain them or reproduce them completely. That could be a reason why they're not want to talk about it, kind of a matter of pride or worrying that people would panic. That's always been given as an example, as a possibility. And that goes way back. I mean, 1960, the Brookings Institute was, paid by NASA to give a report, and it was a long, good sized report, but only one section at the end was talking about if there was evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence, and basically recommending that they better be careful about revealing that to the public because we have examples from history where superior culture meets an inferior culture, and it doesn't go well for the inferior culture and can cause panic. And so that's at least one of the justifications that's been out there for a long time. The other thing is the aerospace industry. If these things are real and they actually are able to reverse engineer some of it, that's a big money making thing. And some claims that the way if this is true and the contracts have been awarded a certain way, showing favoritism of source, that's actually illegal with government contracts. It could lead to all kinds of legal stuff. If that were revealed, and of course, the other things that people say, well, it would reveal too much that would compromise national security. And that's the main reason that's given for the secrecy about anything having to do with it. And I'm sure there's certain things you wouldn't want to, have some kind of image that's going to have data around the edge of it that's going to tell you exactly where that thing was if it's over China somewhere or something. But those are all, I mean, that's nothing new for me to say. Those are all kind of the normal speculations. What do you think?
Yeah, my view is the national security thing is a poor excuse, right? Like, we have people studying nuclear engineering in our universities. The other thing, too, is you don't have to tell us, we have 75 craft. They're stored in, grid coordinate 614. That's not what people are asking for. They're just, are we alone? Yes or no? And, what do you know about the different entities that have been encountered? Are there, discrete, just something like that? Do we have treaties with these things? Do we just simple, I don't think any of that would compromise national security. In fact, it might enhance it, right? Let's say you're dealing, again, I'm just making this up and speculating, but let's say you're dealing with one particular species and you think you're the only one with a treaty. And then suddenly, you announce that we have a treaty, and the Russians are like, wait, we thought we only had an exclusive treaty. Wait, what? Right? So there's all sorts of sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? And there's there are people yeah.
Okay, I was just saying. So, one of the responses to that is, well, if you reveal even the basic stuff, eventually everybody's going to demand to know the rest.
So then you do what you're doing then. Then you just revert to the old program, do what you're doing. That's that's what I don't like. There's just all these excuses, and it's just a failure to be imaginative and creative. And that's what's so, I mean, my view is there has to be something so dark, so horrifying that any disclosure of it would fundamentally disrupt human society. So as again, I'm just making this up. I also write science fiction and horror and stuff like that. So I'm not saying I've heard this. I'm just making this up. Let's say, if you look at all the epochs in Earth's history, the species that typically survive are burrowing species that are able to burrow underground. So imagine that there was some species that's been around here for millions of years and was able to, during each one of these cataclysms, was able to burrow into the ground. And they're an underground species, and they're millions of years more advanced than we are, and they typically come up from time to time and do what they're going to do. And maybe they farm us. Maybe they eat human protein. Again, that's horrifying, but like, I don't think people want to know that, right? And I don't think that would be so.
I don't know. There
Anyway,
are at least some of us. If it were true, I'd want to know it. I would want to know it.
I would want to know too, but then again, the government, the people are going to demand the government to, have an expedition to take these things out
Yeah,
after
send some
millions of
nukes down
years.
there, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there's no way. Yeah, there's no way. Anyway, but
I think
it could be
another
the
reason.
secret is so deep and dark, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think another reason maybe to just could be just saving face. We all know that trust in the government right now is at all-time low levels, and
Mm-hmm.
to be able to come out and finally admit, yeah, it's been around, we knew about it, and we've lied to you. Uh, that's only going to make all that worse. Uh, I'm just saying that's another justification given to it, but that's not a good justification. So if you won't trust me anymore, if you find out I lied to you, so I'll continue to lie to you. It's not a good argument, right?
Well, and I think, I don't know how much longer. Again, I don't want to be too negative, but I don't know how much longer it's going to last. I mean, in terms of just the, again, I'm going to try to avoid politics in any way, but there's so much corruption right now that it's difficult to see us getting past that and into a disclosure environment. I actually think a disclosure is about the only thing the kind of institutional government could do to restore confidence. It's kind of like an olive branch. Because, I mean, right now you have, again, without getting into things that, if you have government agencies controlling social media companies, telling them who to platform, who to deplatform, stuff that's just beyond the pale in terms of violation of, uh, the First Amendment. And, um, even you look at the Army's recruiting standard, like they had to reduce 20 some thousand positions because they couldn't recruit enough soldiers, and it's primarily one demographic. And I'm not going to say it online, but that demographic has traditionally taken the majority of casualties in our wars, 85% of the casualties, and has been a traditional feeder to the military. And they're not sending their sons and daughters anymore because they've lost confidence and faith in in the people that run us. And I don't think it's not necessarily the institutions. It's just the corruption at the top. Like I think the longer they sit on this, the worse it's going to get. I think giving people something to contemplate can help us rise above our petty differences and look beyond. And I think right now the only thing we have to look at are, these corrupt human beings that are kind of running the government. I mean, they can invest in stocks. It's completely legal for them to engage in insider trading, like, and it has been for years. Like, how is that acceptable? So, as I said, it's kind of like an olive branch. I think it's like not that I'm not saying that I'm not encouraging anybody to do bad things. I'm just saying I think many Americans feel like this government doesn't. And I'm not talking about any particular administration. I just don't think they feel it represents them in any way, shape, or form. They're just the entity. They're just Caesar, and we just render unto Caesar what is his, and that's it.
Yeah, I think
So
you're right.
anyway,
I
you
think
don't have
it's
to comment. You
the
don't have to
confidence, but
comment on
just
that.
confidence in government. Yeah, and confidence in authority of all kinds is, I think, at a very, very low place. And this issue plays right into it. Yeah,
And that's the thing. It's like a dilemma for the current presidential candidates, right? They could harm the incentives are all wrong. They could harm their political positions by even talking about this. Again, anecdotally, I read somewhere. So when I say I read somewhere, don't take this as gospel or true because I have no way of verifying it. But it's alluded to that Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor has basically shut down this issue with the help of Austin. And his view is it's not based on a national security argument, but based on a political argument. Which, by the way, I was trained by Dr. Ash Carter, who was Obama's Secretary of Defense, and the one thing that he taught me was when you present policy options to a politician, it is devoid of domestic politics. You do not look at that. It is not part of the equation. You just do what is right. And it seems like that discipline or that lesson has not passed on to kind of his forebears who are currently running the government. And I'm not placing a blame on either. But the rumor is that they shut it down because it would harm the president's reelection prospects by even talking about it. So I don't know, it just kind of depresses me to even think about if that's true. Again, if that's true. I don't know if that's true. Let me see. Yeah, so what about kind of the interdimensional aspect? I mean, that's even kind of stranger.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem is defining dimension and then interdimensional.
Right, you'll drive a physicist crazy by even using that word.
And even, for traditional Catholic and theological language. So if an angel is non-corporeal, so is not a creature of our space-time universe, but is from outside that and can affect it, is that what you would call interdimensional? Because if it is, then we'd say, well, yeah, if that's the definition, then of course there are interdimensional beings, they're angels. But that may not be what they mean.
And by that definition, you could argue the same thing about humans if they, with the soul, right? The soul might be interdimensional, right? And I don't know
for sure. When the person dies and the soul and body separate, then the soul goes on. So to what could be seen as another dimension, but it all depends on how you define it. And like you said, I think the physicists would have the hardest time settling on some kind of definition for that. But it certainly could be something that. Oh, go ahead.
Came up with even though physicists are the ones who came up with quantum mechanics and the double slit experiment and the if you're looking at it, it acts like an electron. If you're not looking at it, it acts like a probabilistic wave, right?
So, yeah, I love science, and I've learned so much from them, and the Catholic tradition has learned so much from them, and a lot of Catholics have been great scientists, and but I think we're just on the threshold of all kinds of new understanding, or at least new mysteries, especially at the quantum level, but in this issue as well with this anomalous phenomena that we can't quite figure out. One of the best things I think it's done, and I meet people again and again who will say that they had a very tidy notion of the universe that was what we would call in philosophy materialist, that everything is matter, energy, field, those kinds of things, that there's nothing outside that, nothing, no God, no spirits, no angels, no soul, no life after death. It's all, it's materialist. And that encountering the UAP phenomena has kind of messed up that tidy view. I had to say, yeah, there's a lot more here than science at this point at least can even describe, let alone understand or explain. And that's been a good thing for them. It's kind of broken them out of a very constrained view of reality. And as a Christian, I applaud that and say, yeah, there are a lot of things that you can't put in a test tube or measure or that kind of thing. That's not to dismiss science. It's done so much for us. But the notion of scientism, this notion that if science can't explain something, then it's not real or measured or whatever. The more people that break out of that into some kind of wider view of reality, the better.
How do you think this plays out? And when I say this, I mean disclosure or just understanding that we're not alone. And is it going to be like a switch, or is it going to be a dial where we're just slowly acclimated into it?
Oh, great question. I think a dial, if it's us, if we're the ones making the disclosure. But what you always have to keep in mind is that if they're real and they're out there, they might have their own plans.
Yeah, they have a vote.
They might decide on a catastrophic disclosure, to use the current term, And people talk about them showing up on the White House lawn, and of course they have flown over the White House back in the 50s, and everybody's forgotten about that. But it would, even then, it would have to be something that so much today can be faked. I mean, you can have fake photos, fake videos.
That's the other problem too.
And the other
that's
thing
merging, right?
There are people, some people who don't believe these things are real, that like some Christians that don't believe they're real and that they're just demonic, that if you say, what if a UFO, kind of landed on the White House lawn, like people talk about, or your own house, they have these other things they've come up with, the Project Bluebeam, and it's all going to be holograms with the holographic manipulation. And they've got kind of like folks who don't believe that, in the moon landing, that they've always got some position they can fall back on to show that it's, you can explain it a different way. So,
well, and science might have the last laugh on them because maybe we are, very dense holograms, right? We're projected from a higher dimension, right? I mean, I'm not, that idea's out there. That idea's out there.
Of course,
Reality as we know it is we're just projections from a higher dimension. I mean, like a higher physical dimension, right? If we're in kind of 4 dimensions, the fourth being time, kind of a fifth dimension, we would. It's just like watching a movie, right? It looks like it's 3-dimensional, but it's really a 2-dimensional projection of a 3-dimensional reality. So anyway, I'm not smart enough to figure out which one of these has merit and which doesn't, but you can easily see how it's kind of gone haywire because we've kind of pursued, at least the physics community, very doggedly string theory. And, they've gotten beguiled by the beauty of the mathematics. And I'm not saying it's wrong, but a lot of these other areas of inquiry were not necessarily ignored, but deprioritized. So, maybe this whole, what do you make of the whole consciousness, kind of concept?
It's one of those things where I keep thinking, all right, it comes out of this thing where you have a culture that's in certain ways been materialist and, philosophically materialist. And then they start bumping into things that don't fit that. So now that's all shattered. We got to find a new paradigm. And for whatever reasons, rather than saying, in Western thought for 25 centuries at least, people have been talking about these issues and they have a proposal, and especially, the Christian and the Jewish tradition as well, that the kind of questions they're asking are questions that the Jewish and Christian traditions, Muslim traditions have answered, that you ought to at least consider that. But instead they're it's almost like because they're post-Christian, they've already decided that's not true. So we got to go looking elsewhere. And they pick up on ideas that either from the East, religious East, or from Gnostic traditions, occult traditions. And that leaves them with, having foundations that give awards for people to write about post-mortem survival, life after death, and is it possible? And you have a lot of folks like myself saying, I really wish you would at least consider what the Christian tradition has been saying all along, that yes, there's a God who's transcendent, beyond all this, created it all. It's not self-existent. He's intelligent. He's loving. He's created all this, and he does have a will and is intervening. He holds it all in existence by himself, moment by moment himself. And that, there is a soul. There's a dimension to human nature that is not physical, and that there are beings that aren't physical, and things have a purpose, and all those things, and especially that the soul survives death. And for us, the great guarantor of that is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And but for folks to just ignore that altogether, it's one thing if they look at it seriously and say, okay, I don't accept that, but to just no, we're going to talk about postmortem survival, but we're not going to talk about that, not that resurrection, not that life after death, not the fact that within the Catholic tradition you have all these apparitions of people who are supposed to be dead, or so you're going to just rule that out as any kind of evidence of postmortem survival. So I'd hope that folks, okay, look at the occult traditions, but look at the Christian tradition as well, and look at the answers they're given to the questions that you're asking, and give it some serious consideration. It's there's a reason why it's been around a long time. and why they're just starting with Catholics. There are 1.3 billion Catholics in the world. Maybe that's something worth looking at.
And what do you think the motives of whoever these NHIs are? I mean, for all we know, it could be one thing overall, or it could be many different factions with many different intentions and objectives and things like that. Why do you think they haven't blown the lid off of this and disclosed themselves?
Yeah, great question. We all wrestle with that one. And again, as we both said, I think we're dealing with a lot of different things. It seems to be anyway. And each group or type could have its own motivations. The kind of classic speculations, have become that almost like the Star Trek kind of, you got this motive that you're going to examine and look at things, but you're not going to interfere, interfere with them, so that we're objects of study. But they do seem to have interfered sometimes. Some of them I really don't like. Some of the theories I really don't like that we're kind of zoo animals being observed, or that we are a consumer product. That that I'm just naming those things as what people have said. But
Prison Planet's the other one.
Yeah, yeah, it's funny. Yeah. There's an interesting thing.
Look, I'm not saying that's not true. Like, I have no idea.
Yeah,
it's really dark.
Yeah, what they really are. But it's so funny. You have a Christian writer like C.S. Lewis. He died back in '63, but he wrote some great fiction about this and some nonfiction too, within a Christian point of view, how these things could be. And one of his theories is that that perhaps we're the only intelligent species God created that fell, that turned away from him and then became broken the way we are when practicing so much evil, and that all the others are still in friendship with him and they're good and they don't have evil, and therefore we've been quarantined by God. Don't, you can't, if you get in there, you might get infected, so don't do that. It's kind of funny, but he wasn't the first to say that. It's in my book. You got folks way back when. Oh gosh, I'm trying to remember which philosopher it was, but one who is known for saying that that he thought that God had created the best, possible universe. And so you had people like Voltaire saying, well, but look at all the bad stuff here, goes on Earth. And his idea was, well, what if we're the only planet where that is, and we're like a little speck in the dungeon of a castle, of a kingdom that's huge and really beautiful, but then this one little thing going. And some wag described that as, okay, so what you're saying is that we're the worst possible planet in the best possible universe. Maybe we are. Lord help the others if they come in contact with us.
Well, it could be worse, right? There could be, like, as you mentioned earlier at the beginning of this interview, a fallen, like a planet populated by the fallen, right?
Who aren't being redeemed and won't be redeemed, and so they're basically demons with bodies and craft. Yeah. So, again, you can get a lot of dark thoughts thinking about that. But I just have to go back to the Christian fundamental that God created it all. He loves it all. He has a plan for it all. And even though whenever he allows evil, it's in part because he can always bring a greater good out of it. What the greater good is hard for us to see right now. But and that's why I'm hopeful about the whole thing. I don't, like Lozano says, it might make us so somber. We would hear what he had heard. But along with the somberness, I think there's a great hope and excitement on my part that, there could be all kinds of wonderful things revealed, new things that expand our horizons. Yeah.
The somber comment, I think, was inspired by, I think someone asked him to read a novella called Chains of the Sea. Are you familiar with this? By Gardner Doujou.
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it. Yep.
I mean, just kind of the top line about it is the story is about these craft land in 3 locations, I think, like my home state of Delaware, Venezuela, and Ohio. And there's a kid who can kind of see NHIs all around him, like native NHIs that have been here, cryptoterrestrial type things. And there's also, I think it was written or published in 1973. So it was in the context of the Cold War. So you had the communist Soviet Russia and the United States, and they were both developing AI, and AI was you know was able to identify the existence of these crypto-terrestrials. And the aliens in this story, the ETs that land, pay humanity no mind whatsoever. We're barely noticeable to them. But the at the end of the day, there are NHIs that really run the planet, and it's not us, and we're just kind of, and we're barely noticeable, barely worth mentioning. And I think when Lou Elizondo says somber, I think it's this indicator that we're not at the top of the food chain, so to speak. Now, what that means, who knows? I mean, even the Catholic tradition would say, yeah, the angels would
Yeah, the angels
be
are
much
higher
higher
in
than
certain ways than we are.
right,
Yeah, yeah.
right. So
So
it's not inconsistent necessarily, but I think everybody should try to read that story
hmm.
and kind of. But that's, I think, where he gets the somber comment. I could be wrong, but I think that's where it comes from.
Even then, again, in the Catholic tradition, the affirmation that when creatures do bad things to themselves and some are oppressed by others, that God's always on the side of the oppressed to help them and in the end to redeem them, save them. So even if the creatures here who either indifferent to us or don't have our best interests at heart, um, God's still on our side.
Yeah, I think the other question I want to ask you is, in this field, people talk a lot about downloads, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where they have ideas and then they end up. I think Tim Taylor is the classic example
Mm-hmm.
in Pasolka's work, American Cosmic, where he's invented a number of patents, but he's not really necessarily classically trained as a kind of medical device expert. Yet he designs these these downloads
Mm-hmm.
and makes them a reality and has made a fortune doing that. What do you make of these downloads? Are they? I just leave it open that way without being specific.
Yeah, I mean it's a computer term applied to
Right.
a human uh,
Yeah,
experience,
inspiration. They call it
and
the
you could
spark of
so
inspiration,
inspiration.
divine
I mean, you had
inspiration. Right.
the ancient Greeks and Romans talking about the muses, who
Right.
inspired artists and musicians and that kind of thing, um, and I think certainly within the Christian tradition, you've got the notion that God can reveal things to us to help us, that either through angels, through an intermediary, or directly. You have all kinds of, I think, Christian artists and scientists who believe that they were inspired by God to do that. So if you want to call that a download, sure. Um, is it possible that it's coming from non-human intelligence? I suppose if they have, I mean, certainly it could be demonic or angelic, but other kinds of non-human intelligence. I, if they're creatures that are actually interested in helping us and they can somehow put the thought directly into his mind and he develops a device that's going to help humans medically, I wouldn't have any problem with that. um, we, I, I think even on our own, we might be able eventually to develop some kind of more direct transfer thought that we don't have now. But that's an open question. But yeah, it doesn't surprise me that such a thing could happen. The main question, of course, is what's the source? If it's a good thing being used for good like that, medical inventions, then I'd be very happy to say that he got a download from the Holy Spirit of God, or from his guardian angel, or that kind of thing. But
Now,
there's
what do
plenty
you?
of room for that.
So I think yesterday I was listening to an old Art Bell interview of Malachi Martin, Father
Mm-hmm.
Malachi, or I don't know if Doctor, Father Doctor. I don't know which takes precedence, but
He's got your father. Yeah, yeah.
and one of the things he was saying was, and again, this is in 1995 or 1996, so we're coming on, what's that, 30 years, 30 years ago, something like that. Is that right? Yeah, coming up
Coming
on
up
30
on. Yeah.
years. So, or 28, whatever. But I think Art Bell asked him about transcendental meditation, and I think Father Martin said something like, "I wouldn't touch it because you're clearing your mind, and you might be inviting something in." Now I don't know what to make of that, but I hadn't heard that take before, but I felt like it was something that you should be very careful and listen carefully to. What do you make of that? Is that his opinion? Is that kind of the Catholic Church's official view? Is that something that is still accurate, or is it just one of those things that you need to be careful? It's not, you just need to tread carefully. It's not necessarily a bad practice, but you need to tread carefully.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the church has an official position on TM, but transcendental meditation. But there are plenty of experiences that exorcists can tell you of people kind of either emptying their mind so much that other stuff came in that wasn't good, or especially of invoking something. And that's why I have some great concerns by people who want to go out and invoke, call down UFOs to appear.
So you're
Um,
talking about
and
CE5
yeah,
specifically.
yeah, and similar things. Even folks like Luke Elizondo said, if you don't really know what it is you're invoking or calling down, it's probably wise not to do it. You could be inviting something very, very dark, evil into you. So I would say, the experience I've had in the diabolical stuff and research, um, I would be both very careful of just trying to totally empty your mind and then let whatever comes in come in. Not condemning it, but I'm saying it's be wary of that, and especially wary of invoking things, calling down things, inviting things in that you don't really know what they are. You don't know what they could very well be evil. Yeah.
Well, actually, that raises the next question because I don't think I've ever had, or at most maybe one. But what do you make of channelers and channeling?
Yeah, in that case, the church does have a very clear position. It goes back to Scripture, Old Testament Scripture, that we are not to try to contact the dead that way, and there's a good reason for it. The within the classical Christian understanding of demons, there's a notion of a familiar demon or familiar spirit, and that is
Mm-hmm.
that demons they live forever, so they can go through human lifetime and another, and that there could be a demon assigned. Typically, is to a person to kind of observe everything about their lifetime and to know all kinds of things about them. Not to read their minds necessarily, that's a big question, but just watch them and remember all that. And then to appear later to try to deceive someone after that person has died and to use information that only that person would have known, you think, but the demon also knows. So I give an example. So you have a widow who's grieving her husband, died recently, and
Mm-hmm.
she's wondering where the will is, and she can't find it. Then all of a sudden, there's an apparition in her room, and it looks like her husband. And he talks to her and says, "Yes, I'm your husband." And she says, "Well, if you're really my husband, tell me where the will is." And he says, "Oh yeah, it's in the third drawer in the back." You like that. And she goes and it's there. And she says, "Oh, it's my husband. It's really my husband. Only he knew that." And then maybe starts having conversations with it. No, it doesn't necessarily have to be your husband. It could be a familiar spirit that a kind of counterfeiting thing that happens all the time. And so it's one thing for a saint who's someone who's deceased at God's bidding to come and appear to someone and give them a message, but it's another for you to on your own kind of try to invoke a particular dead person or that kind of thing, because there's a good chance it will be a demon counterfeiting that dead person, and you get into big trouble. So I think that's at least one of the reasons why in Scripture, the Bible, and throughout Christian tradition, that specific thing is the church says don't do it, don't do it. It's dangerous.
Are you familiar with the skull experiments where they were kind of doing seances for years and had all sorts of uh, apports that would appear where they could pass their hands through solid objects and then it would appear again. They would put film in rooms and it would or just put literally film sealed in the box. It would take pictures, or there would be pictures in the film. And I think they stopped the experiment because it kind of may have gotten a little out of hand toward
Mm-hmm.
the latter years. But are you familiar with that? I think it's Scole, Scole, UK.
Yes, I'm not familiar with it. I mean, but I know there's been a lot of research done in that regard. But I think I think it's really risky, really risky.
What have you heard in the research that you've done about those sorts of things? Like, I mean, we don't need to talk about Ouija boards. I think people know that, just stay the heck away from those things.
I hope
But
so. I hope so.
but seances, what have you learned kind of in just studying that sort of activity, and what tends to come out of it?
Well, again, I mean, my approach has been that because the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition before it warns me against it, then I don't want to try it. During my atheist period, I did um, attempt to take part in some of those, and I think that's why later on I had some demonic encounters. That's my personal, conclusion. Um, there's a good reason why it's been forbidden for a long time. And I know, there are plenty of people I know and respect, especially even in the UAP community that disagree with me on that. But I feel very strongly about it because of when you hear from exorcists who are dealing with these things all the time and seeing physical manifestations and that kind of thing, and they tell you don't ever do that, then I take them at their word, and they're just affirming what's been taught in the church for 2,000 years and centuries in Judaism before that.
Have you seen any statistics on this sort of stuff, like in terms of certified exorcisms that have happened? What kind of the Has there been any effort to identify what the source was, like what opened the gate to whatever it was to come in,
Yeah, I doubt that
or
there are
what activities?
any
Hmm.
stats, but anecdotal evidence from exorcists, all kinds of things. Yeah, so that certainly that kind of thing, a lot of occult activity doing that. Sometimes serious kinds of um, but it's serious kinds of immoral behavior can open doors. Um, Certainly, satanic worship can open doors. Um, Terrible trauma to children, especially committed by their parents, can open doors. Um, yeah, there are plenty of things. You could read more about them in my book, but there are certain things that, again and again, exorcists will mention as things that have led to that. Because they can interrogate the spirit basically, and eventually it has to tell them the truth about how it came in.
So I think later this month, not on this radio show, but on my podcast, I'm interviewing a gentleman. His name is Jerry Mazursky. And are you familiar with him at all?
No.
So he is a mental health professional, I think retired mental health professional, and he worked with a lot of schizophrenics. And after a decade or more of being in mental institutions, he's kind of come to the conclusion that the behavior of these schizophrenics, the drugs only dull kind of their natural human senses, but there are entities effectively inside them or possessing them or tormenting them that he as a medical health professional had conversations with, and they were not the same person
Mm-hmm.
that had kind of the schizophrenia. So I haven't spent a lot of time I haven't spoken to him yet, but have you heard anything kind of like that, or that at least points to that thesis?
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing where I wouldn't want to say anyone with anyone who's schizophrenic is demon possessed. Would never say that. Just like there was a time when it, any person that centuries ago that any person who had a seizure automatically people said he's demon possessed, demon possessed. Now we come to find out that it's medical condition, but that doesn't mean that there are also still people who are demon possessed who have the same symptoms. So it's that kind of thing. I would never say anyone who's been diagnosed schizophrenic is demon possessed. I want to make that clear. But
Right.
but yes, yes, I have talked to exorcists before who, when with someone who is diagnosed that way, more than one, someone diagnosed that way, that it turned out that one of those, if you want to call it multiple personalities, it really wasn't some kind of, how would you put it, alternative personality of the human, but actually an external thing that had entered them. That's demonic.
Now, I think when we spoke last in one of the, I think, two interviews we did, you mentioned that over the last 20, 30 years or so, they started training exorcists in the United States because there was such a demand. What's driving that, and is that still the case?
Well, from the exorcists I've talked to, several things. Um, One is that there are more people than ever who are doing the kinds of things that open themselves to demonic powers. Uh, and then it's kind of a double whammy. It happens at the same time when the kind of resources available in the Christian tradition, we believe is the power of God through the sacraments and sacramentals, exorcisms, that kind of stuff. That at a time when the people who are doing that uh, don't avail themselves of the sacraments, they don't believe in that, and so at the very same time when you're opening doors to darkness, you've abandoned the one power that can save you from it. And so it gets bad, and a lot of times they eventually then will come to the church and say, I've heard you can cast out demons. And that's kind of where the journey begins. But yeah, I think that's the case. There's such a demand, and they are being trained here. And yeah, I get all kinds of people talking to me about it all the time.
Do you still do? I don't know if consultation is the right word, but do you still do people from the officials from the church or people affiliated with the church reach out to you to ask for your advice on some of these things still? Or you said
Yeah, occasionally a priest will. It's usually that. I would never encourage anybody to get in touch with me directly. I can't, But if
right.
if it's a case where someone has already approached a priest, sometimes they'll ask me to. But there are plenty of other people that can be asked as well.
What's the kind of the attitude in the church? Like, are there some priests that won't even touch it and kind of ignore it, or will ignore people who approach them, or are there some priests that are a little bit more? In other words, even within the Catholic Church, are there kind of biases in terms of treating this? Do you have to give the right priest if there's an incident that you're trying to report?
Yeah, I mean, basically what you're saying is, are there people who have lost some of the Catholic tradition that's been held for centuries and centuries? And yeah, there are some
Right.
who've lost that and turned away from it, and some of those folks they're priests and they're approached by someone with this possibility that they won't even assess, just in your mind. But then others who are still embrace the tradition in all of its fullness and recognize that these things have been seen as a reality and dealt with for centuries, and they'll take it seriously. And so yeah, sometimes it does depend on which priest you go to, how you'll be received.
Now, if you're tuning in now, you're listening to Through a Glass Darkly Radio on United Public Radio, and I'm speaking to Dr. Paul Thigpen. Okay, so where do we go now when we have all these? We're talking about NHIs from either some other physical reality or from the stars. At the same time, we're also talking about angels and demons. How you have the religious traditions on the latter, but on the former, how do you think humanity is going to evolve and process this sort of stuff? Because there seems to be a non-physical element. I hesitate to say spiritual on the NHIs, but there's certainly seems to be a non-physical element. How do you think humanity is going to reconcile that with existing religious traditions where there's also a non-physical slash spiritual element, going forward? How do you think we're going to figure that out?
Well, people will come to different conclusions for sure. There'll be folks like myself who are saying, okay, I have room for this. And just because some of the characteristics of this may resemble certain characteristics of things we know doesn't mean they're the same thing. It's, I mean, the church has learned from science, and so I think if it is science that's able to begin to help us understand these things better, then incorporate that in. But you still have, plenty have folks who just say I don't understand it, and it makes me uncomfortable. Therefore, it's the devil. And God bless it. I pray for them, but I think that'll only lead to fear and confusion if they take that attitude. That if you start just reading the literature, I don't mean all the crazy stuff, but things like Ross Coulthard or some of the other things where it's just kind of helping you connect the dots of what is happening, so that you begin to realize, okay, there is something happening. It's real. Doesn't seem to be human, and most of it doesn't seem to be demonic. So to start with that, and then to have an attitude of humility, that okay, God's really big. There's plenty of room for mystery. There's certain things He's told us that we're going to believe to be true, and that we have to fit it into. But all kinds of things are possible out there. So let's see what comes to the surface. And if we continue to have a situation where all we've got is people's private experiences, then we will have quite a variety of responses. If we can get some public things where people kind of saying, okay, this really is what's happened, then I think people can begin to accommodate those in what they already believe. They'll have to change some things, but especially if they believed it was all demonic, and then they finally get a chance to meet one of these, and turns out they're a really nice guy. So I don't know, I'm wondering, but I guess the point is, we'll be all over the place. People of faith or different faiths will be all over the place in their response. But I think some responses will be closer to reality, and some responses will be more healthy mentally, emotionally, rather than full of fear and panic. And
yeah, we unfortunately live in a time right now when all this is coming out when it's hard to discern the truth, and I think it's going to be even more so hard to do that once you start injecting AI. I mean, you're already seeing it. I saw a convincing video of the Loch Ness monster this morning. Right? It looks. I mean, it looks real. It's not real. It's obviously an AI fake. But you're going to see politicians saying outrageous things that they'd never said. You're going to see politicians denying they said outrageous things when they really did, and blaming AI. And I think we just live in this time of deception's not necessarily the right word, but where there's a fundamental distrust of just reality, right? Like, how do I know what I know?
Yep. Well, how do I? Perception.
But yeah. even now, you hear about certain things come out. Like we look at, like, just take. I'm not going to go into it, but take the origin of the pandemic, right? You start to learn these officials that very likely lied to our faces over and over and over again. And it makes you wonder, well, if they're lying about this, what else are they lying about? And how long have they been lying? Is this just because of the internet we're able to expose this? Have they been lying to us for centuries, people in power? So it makes you question literally everything, not just whether or not we're alone in the universe, but whether or not we live in a functioning republic, right? So, I think, how do you think we navigate through this, where we can kind of get back to an environment where people are rewarded for telling the truth, for having integrity, for being honest?
It's got to start at the grassroots level, I guess. People have to practice integrity, join with people of like mind of integrity, and begin building communities from the ground floor up of integrity. That's the only way the culture gets changed. I think you can't change it from the top down. And by media, I don't know if you can change it much by media in a good direction. You can certainly ruin a culture by not exactly the top down, but by bad media, bad entertainment, things like that. But we've got to rebuild the culture, and we can't sit back and hope the government does it. We can't sit back and hope everybody else does it. We got to do it ourselves.
I mean, I know you're coming at this from a Catholic perspective, and I've said this many times. It's almost like we're in a second Protestant Reformation. And I don't mean in a religious sense. I mean in kind of a government sense, right? So like the Peace of Westphalia ushered in the rise of nation states. I think what this particular issue is, disclosure, I think is kind of pushing up against a disintermediating, the government out of the truth business, just like Martin Luther tried to disintermediate the intercession of priests out of the, religious business. And I think the more that government officials lie about this, the more it just hastens that sort of outcome, which would be horrific, right? If people suddenly just said, you know what, we're not going to pay taxes this year. Figure it out. You don't do anything for us anyway. So like,
well, what happened once before? Actually, now that you mentioned that with Luther, the peasants' revolt in Germany.
Oh, really? So, Martin Luther?
Yeah. Well, Luther had it has basically said, guys, you don't need a pope, you don't need authority, be your own pope. Basically, I'm paraphrasing, but and the peasants of Germany, who were chafing under the authority and the rule of the nobility, the nobles, revolted and justified what they were doing by appealing to what Luther had said and said, yeah, I mean, again, I'm paraphrasing, we don't need a pope, but we don't need a noble or king either, and kind of put a political application on it. And yeah, what did happen was terrible. It was the revolt was put down brutally, a lot of bloodshed. Mm-hmm. And Luther himself wrote this infamous essay about, because he's afraid his Reformation was going to be lost if the nobles didn't support it. And they had political reasons for supporting it because they themselves didn't want to be under the Holy Roman Emperor's control. So, just wrote this infamous essay about, no, guys, it's not, that's not the case. Don't take my words for that. And you rulers go out there, and famous phrase, if you have to, make the blood run all the way up to the stirrups of the men riding the horses, but put this revolt down. All I'm saying is that, the parallel you've already drawn is that, when you start mistrusting totally and trying to throw off all authority, it can be disastrous.
Yeah, that's what.
But right now, we have good reasons for not trusting.
That's what scares me too, because you need to have some form of authority. It's just the people that represent us are not the best of us, and part of that is just systemic, in the sense that if you're a good person, why would you subject yourself, unless you were kind of a megalomaniac or malignant narcissist? Why would you want to put up with getting sued if you just run for a public office, or have your reputation destroyed, or things just made up about you? What virtuous person would ever want to subject themselves to that? So we're kind of in this death spiral that I think the grassroots, by leading by example, is kind of the only thing that we can do. But when people in power are telling you black is white and hot is cold, and it's that can only last for so long, and hopefully we are able to get out of it in a gentle manner. But I'm worried about it.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah,
and
I'm doing a lot of praying these days.
Yeah,
going back to praying these days. Yeah.
Going back to the disclosure issue again, and the only reason I keep saying this is it's the disclosure is just another facet of that aspect, right? It's just tell us the truth, and there's just other things too, that we're extending ourselves in ways, and then we're not taking responsibility for extending ourselves and not preparing for the natural consequences, right? So as an example, it is noble to support Ukraine, but we haven't mobilized, right? Like we're running out of ammunition. Our ammunition plants are catching on fire. It's just simple stuff that 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago, they would have anticipated these sorts of things. And our current leaders aren't. They just think that the magic power of the might of the United States is going to suddenly carry the day. But you're not going to have that much might if you don't have any ammunition to protect yourself. So anyway, these things are any on that super positive note, Doctor. Are you any future events that you can talk about with the Soul Foundation?
No, I'm not by any means part of the leadership of that. Anyway, I was honored to be a speaker at their conference and now to write this paper. So beyond that, I don't know a lot, but I hope to find out. I'm pretty sure that they'll have another symposium at some point. But I'm not speaking officially. I'm just saying that's my expectation anyway.
And then
and other white papers. Yeah.
And I think we have about 3 minutes left. So in the last 3 minutes, what do you want to leave the audience with in terms of we covered a variety of topics from theological with the nature of good and evil. We covered the nature of disclosure, how things may or may not kind of progress. We talked about the social fabric and how it's kind of lies and deceit are kind of making the foundation a little bit wobbly right now, and how do we as people with integrity, how to kind of navigate through those challenges. What's your kind of, given that, I mean, we covered a lot of ground. So with all that in mind, what final words would you leave for the audience and advice?
Well, I'd encourage folks not to be afraid. It may be somber, like Lou said, but not to be afraid, to be careful about the sources that they believe. I mean, this thing, it's not just official authority that people are suspicious of. They should be suspicious of a good half of what's on social media and other places.
Mm-hmm.
So encourage you to check things out and do your homework to try to connect the dots. But I would especially say, again, speaking as a Catholic Christian, especially if you're someone for whom all these topics have kind of begun to break open a tidy materialist notion of the universe, and you're looking for something, or you're realizing there's something more than all that. I'd urge you to consider the claims of the Catholic Church, the Christian religion, and a whole lot of good stuff from the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers as well. There's a lot of really good stuff in the Western tradition that you may find gives you some answers and some consolation and some hope, rather than trying to start all over and say, okay, is consciousness real, or what is it, or is there life after death? I want to say, yeah, there is. There's life after death. There's a God who created us and loves us, and he's waiting for you.
Thank you, Dr. Thigpen. Paul, it's always a pleasure, and thank you for spending tonight with my audience. I'm sure they all appreciate your scholarship, and I know I threw a lot of stuff at you, so my apologies for not giving you more.
It's always an exciting conversation with you, Sean, and I really appreciate it. Appreciate you and your honesty and your integrity yourself, and trying to get to the bottom of so many things, and your experience and competence in so many fields. So, thanks for having me. God bless you.
The other thing I didn't thank, Chester, thank you very much, my friend, for the super sticker. I didn't get a chance to thank you for that, so thank you. All right, well, Paul, you have a great night, and we'll continue to talk. And I definitely enjoy your company and your knowledge. I mean, your knowledge is. I asked you a lot of ignorant questions, and admittedly ignorant, but I appreciate your patience with me and answering them.
My pleasure, brother. Good to be here. Thanks.